Carleton.
To be or not to be? That is the question. Section 2B of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is at stake. It reads, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of the press, and other media of communication. Section 2B of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees us all the liberty to express ourselves without reserve and without coercion from the state. That is a core principle of our constitutional heritage. Though it was embedded in the Charter in '82, it goes back hundreds of years through the English liberty that this parliamentary system transmitted from one generation to the next. And if I can quote a great English author, Orwell, he said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. This bill seeks to take away that right and those freedoms. Don't take my word for it. I can quote directly from one of at least two former commissioners of the regulatory body that will be empowered under this bill to control internet content. Peter Menzies described the bill as an assault on freedom of expression. Another former CRTC member explained that it would allow political appointees to determine what we see and say on the internet. There's a lot we don't know about this bill. Well, for one, because numerous of its amendments were voted before they were even made public at a committee. In my 17 years here, have never seen that happen before. And two, because the minister can't answer basic questions, like, for example, the bill supposedly protects Canadian content. However, the minister can't tell us what Canadian content is. He was questioned by our terrific heritage critic about numerous examples of things that she asked if he understood whether they were Canadian content or not, and he couldn't answer. So we don't know what will be promoted or demoted online under the rubric of Canadian content because no one in Parliament seems able to define it. Well, I have a very simple definition. If it's made by a Canadian and it's posted online, it's Canadian content. But unfortunately, that definition doesn't work for this government. If it did, we wouldn't need the bill. We just let people continue to post the things they want and watch the things they want and leave them be in freedom and peace. But no, they want a series of bureaucrats, unnamed, unelected, unknown, to decide what Canadian content is heard and what is not. So, for example, when the CBC runs an effectively plagiarized news story that you can get on CNN, and they do it from Washington with a Washington-based reporter, and it is exclusively about American politics, doesn't even say the word Canada in it, it will be considered Canadian content. Why? Because, of course, it was paid for, tragically, by Canadian tax dollars. But other than that, there's literally nothing Canadian about it. Yet if a community association in your neighborhood, your Canadian neighborhood, tells you about a local food drive that's happening, it's a Canadian neighborhood, a Canadian author, a Canadian story, a Canadian initiative in a Canadian city, read almost exclusively by Canadian readers, that would not be considered, presumably, Canadian content, and therefore it would be demoted. But then that's just the daily pedestrian content that we get online. What about the more contentious stuff? Well, the government is going to decide what kind of political views are Canadian. Now, of course, endorsing this Prime Minister's leftist ideology will be a prerequisite to Canadiana. We can be sure of that. The Liberal Party has effectively been saying that for generations, that they and only they represent Canadian values, and therefore only the values they espouse would be considered Canadian for the purpose of this act. Furthermore, they can't tell us, not only can they tell us what content would be acceptable and what would not, they can't tell us who would be subjected to the bill. Originally, they had an explicit exemption for users, your everyday Joe and Jane who post stuff online. It's called user-generated content, and the Justice Department said, don't worry, this bill won't affect any of them because there's this very specific exemption that excludes them. And they show up at committee all of a sudden, and just like that, that exemption was removed. And so now, everyday Joe and Jane posting online are regulated. Well, the minister says, no, we won't bother them. We'll only bother people who have large social media followings. So I think he said on television that it was something like 100,000 followers. Well, I have 100,000 subscribers on my YouTube page, so presumably I would be subject to this regulation. We would have some sort of bureaucrat over at the CRTC judging whether my political views are Canadian enough to be seen by Canadian eyes. Those things not considered Canadian enough would presumably be filtered, demoted, or eliminated altogether from the internet. The platforms on which we make our political statements will obviously be concerned about the penalties they could face if they end up on the wrong side of a bureaucrat or a politician, and therefore they will begin self-censorship and begin actually proactively and organically censoring things they think the government might not want people to see. And isn't it interesting that they're in such a rush to get this bill passed before the election? Is there content they don't want Canadians to see before voting? Well, that's the only explanation for the sudden rush. They've been in power for half a decade now. This was never a priority before. All of a sudden, they need to ram it through by changing rules, voting on things we haven't seen, curtailing committee hearings in a way that has never been done in parliamentary history, because it has to be in law, and these bureaucrats must have these powers before fall when the Prime Minister wants to call a snap election. And what is most amazing of all is that at least 95% of artists are against this bill. You can look online, the artists by which I refer to the actual producers of artistic material, and the ones that are actually competing in the open and free market that are not in need of a subsidy because people actually want to watch and consume what they produce. Of course, the lobbyists, on the other hand, who are often quoted by the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, and the Liberals, they're all in favor of it. They want to shut out the competition because they had oligopolistic powers for years. The broadcasting corporations love the bill because it would allow the restoration of their oligopolistic powers. So it's a great corporatist power grab, big government and big corporations working together as they always do. Reminds me of Frédéric Bastiat. He was talking about in the French economy, there were all these controls to protect every interest group from competition. And he said, I think we should take this to the logical end. I want to ban windows, because that will mean will double the business for the candle makers. Because without windows, there'd be no light indoors during the day, and you'd have to have more candles to keep the place illuminated. So let's shut out the sun to ban competition with candles and create more jobs for the candle makers. And of course, he meant it only in jest because he was trying to demonstrate the absurdity of trying to bring about prosperity by banning competition. In fact, we have better prosperity, greater light of day when the windows are open, so the light can come in and everybody can see for themselves and choose for themselves. But what is the government so afraid of? That the people might say and see things online that the government does not want said and seen? Why not allow the free exchange of ideas to determine which rise to the top? Sure, there's a clash. Democracy is always messy. It's the worst system except for all the others, as Churchill said. But it's through that clash of ideas that the best ones emerge, and we as a people move forward. Only if we stand true to our constitutional heritage, to be, and uphold that freedom, will we achieve that great success. Thank you.